We want to welcome each of you to episode 3 of the Abundant Life podcast. For those of you that don't know, my name is Brian Egerton, and I'm joined by John Ferguson, and we're both ministers at the North Lexington Church of Christ in Lexington, Kentucky. Both of us have spent some time studying in the field of counseling, and we wanted to use this podcast as a way to share some of that knowledge and some of that study to help those who may be hurting with different things. In this life, it's full of a variety of physical and mental and emotional challenges that we go through and we deal with. And so we wanted to talk through some of those issues and look at them from both a physical and a mental and emotional standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint, and understand what we can do to overcome those challenges, those issues in our life. So today we're going to be talking about guilt and shame. So, John, as we think about this concept of guilt and shame, you ever experienced guilt in your life before?
Oh yeah, on more than one occasion. Growing up, I've heard that a lot. They tell me I ought to be ashamed of myself for some things that I said and done. Oh yes, I've had some shame and I've had some guilt, and in the sense that they pointed out to me how I've done wrong, and I ought to feel bad about what I've done and what I didn't do. So I know a little bit about both of those.
Yeah, guilt and shame are two things they're very similar concepts, but they are slightly different.
Yes.
Guilt is this idea of a feeling of responsibility or remorse for something we've done, whether it's a real thing or it's a perceived thing in our lives. And oftentimes guilt is more of an internal issue, right? We're dealing with something internally where maybe our behavior it conflicts with our conscience.
Gotcha.
But shame, again, very similar, but it's more of an external issue where maybe we're concerned about our reputation or what other people are going to think about us.
Okay.
So guilt, an internal struggle, and shame more of maybe an external struggle, but kind of go along the same lines. So guilt is something that I think all of us have experienced in one way or another in our lives. But talk a little bit about what can shame lead to in our lives?
Shame could lead to a number of emotional struggles and conflict. Matter of fact, when you start talking about feeling shame, people start feeling kind of worthless, have problems with self-esteem. They become frustrated, alone, isolated, and sometimes it can spiral into a dark depression if you don't really work with that. It just attacks you from all fronts, both socially and emotionally.
Yeah, if our guilt and our shame goes unchecked in our lives, it can really lead us down a dangerous path.
Oh yes.
Maybe like you said, a depression, or maybe it leads to more anxiety, or even paranoia, afraid that we're going to do something we're going to experience that guilt or shame in a deeper level. But guilt and shame can be a good thing too. It can lead to positive things, right? It can change to it can lead to a change of our mind or change of behavior, or it can lead us to change the way we think. So guilt and shame can be a positive thing in our lives, as it can be a negative thing if it goes unchecked.
Right.
It's important though that we understand that we must deal with our guilt and our shame in the proper way. Otherwise, it can really control us and lead us down a difficult path in life. So, as we think about this concept of guilt and shame, I think maybe it'd be helpful to us to maybe do a case study.
Yes.
So, let's consider for our time together today the life of the Apostle Paul, and let's consider some of the events in his life that caused him to experience severe guilt and shame in his life. But I want us to notice how he was able to overcome that guilt in his life, and also how the other people in his life affected his ability to overcome his guilt and his shame. So, as we think about the Apostle Paul, let's set the stage a little bit and understand some of the background of him, kind of leading up to the events in his life where maybe he felt the greatest guilt and shame of his life. So if you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open to Acts chapter 9 with us, and that's going to be our main text for today, where we're going to be pulling some ideas and concepts from this. So as we think about the Apostle Paul, before he became a Christian, he was known as a man who had a reputation of tearing down and persecuting the church. In fact, if you go back in Acts chapter 8, the beginning of Acts chapter 8, we see in verse 3 where we're told that he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Right, so this was his goal, this was his objective, this is what he thought was right in life, to persecute the church. And we see it continues as we get into chapter 9, where Paul is walking down the road with letters from the high priest, giving him the authority to drag Christians out of their homes and taking them back to Jerusalem, bound to answer for their crimes of being a Christian. But it's while this is happening that something really interesting happens in the life of Paul. If we look at verse 4, he's traveling down the road with those papers in hand, trying to persecute the church, and this bright light shines upon him, and Jesus begins speaking to him and asking him why he's persecuting him. Can you imagine the psychological distress that this moment must have brought upon the Apostle Paul? You know, here he's thinking he's doing everything right. He thinks he's serving God by persecuting the church and imprisoning those who claim to be followers of Jesus. And now all of a sudden Jesus is speaking to him, and he realizes his whole life that he'd been living up to that point was contrary to what he should have been doing. Talk about the distress that that may have brought upon him.
Well, I tell you what, when you are really bought in the sense of emotionally, socially, religiously, and you are really all in. I mean, you bought totally in. And then you find out that all that you have been thinking, all that you have been taught, all that you have been doing, just goes contrary to what your awakening puts before you. And that turns his world upside down, because as you may mention, this is what I believe. This is what I am convinced of. And all of my emotion, my will, is tied up in doing this. And then all of a sudden, what you believe is undermined, is undercut, and is proven to be wrong. I mean, it kind of takes you in a different place. Your whole world, it's just like your whole house has just come tumbling down, so to speak, emotionally. And it just leaves you trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah. We see clearly this would have affected him in a pretty serious way, mentally and emotionally. But we see the physical distress that it brought upon him too. As you look in Acts chapter 9 and verse 6, we see that he was trembling. And he was astonished. And he began asking Jesus what he'd have him to do. So here we see the physical aspect of his guilt. Right? He's in such guilt that he's trembling because of it. So Jesus has now called him out for his actions. He's realized, man, what I've done all my life is contrary to what I'm supposed to be doing. So then he asks Jesus, what would he have him to do? So Jesus tells him to go travel to Damascus and wait there, and there's going to be a man that's going to meet him there, a man by the name of Ananias, who we'll talk about here in a little bit. So he spent 3 days, we see this in verses 7 through 9, where he spent 3 days without eyesight. And he spent 3 days without eating anything. Again, we see the great distress that this guilt brought upon him, where he wasn't even hungry. He couldn't eat for 3 days. So we see the distress and the turmoil that he was facing because of his grief and the shame of his past life. So it was this moment in his life that we see the Apostle Paul reflect on constantly throughout his ministry. He talks about this moment, this pivotal moment in his life, and the grief and the guilt and the shame that he experienced because of it. So, with that background in mind, let's understand a couple things that we need to keep in mind when we're experiencing guilt that we can learn from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing that I think is really helpful for us to understand when it comes to working through our guilt and shame is that guilt and shame can be both a positive thing and a negative thing for us.
Yes.
For the Apostle Paul, his guilt was a positive thing for his life moving forward. Right? As he was blinded on the road to Damascus, that it was a pivotal moment for him where he had a choice to make, where he could either allow his guilt to overcome him and overwhelm him, and he began to internalize the problem and it continued to fester and become a big issue for him, or he could choose to allow that his grief and his guilt to push him forward.
Yes.
And we see that's exactly what he did. As we move forward, skip ahead in Acts chapter 9, we see where after he'd met with Ananias in verse 18, he obeyed the gospel. He was baptized.
Yes.
And then he let God begin to use him, where he gained his strength, verse 19. And then verse 20, he immediately preached the Christ in the synagogues that he is the Son of God. So his grief became a positive thing for him in helping him move forward in life. But the Apostle Paul is not the only one that's allowed his grief to be a positive thing for him.
That's true.
Talk with us about some other individuals maybe you can think of that.
Look at Peter.
Yeah.
Okay, he's one of the chosen of Jesus. He went through a very difficult time. Jesus said that he was going to deny him, and that happened. And Peter, upon that third denial of Christ, not only did he just deny Jesus of who he was, but he even began to curse Jesus or to wish some bad things to befall him. And then when he did it, then he heard what Jesus had said we would do, and at that time the cock did crow, and then Peter was very saddened. He was very saddened. He was feeling guilty, and hopefully at that point the shame of his rejection before the others caused him to make some changes, to adjust and to move forward. But you had Peter who did it, and not only Peter, but Judas did the same thing. They both betrayed him, and when they betrayed him, Judas got to the point to where he couldn't deal with the guilt of that and the shame of betraying his Lord, and that rather than dealing with the pain and adjusting, he immediately went out and he ended his life. So some people use guilt and shame to develop, and some people cannot adjust to the guilt and shame, and they harm themselves in more ways than one.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about that comparison between Peter and Judas, because as you mentioned, both of them were followers of Jesus. They were both part of the 12 apostles, so they had intimate relationships with Jesus. But both of them denied Jesus.
Yes.
And they betrayed him. Peter used his guilt from denying Jesus to help push him forward and become stronger and more dedicated in the service. And in fact, we see because of his guilt, he continued to focus, and he was the one in Acts chapter 2 who preached that first gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost, and 3,000 souls were saved. But Judas, on the other hand, he experiences this guilt from betraying Jesus, and it's so overwhelming to him that he doesn't see a way out.
Right.
When it comes to experiencing guilt in our lives, if we don't deal with it properly, then it can really wear us down and put us in a dark spot like it did with Judas. And that doesn't necessarily just mean that maybe we get to the point where we take our lives, but there are a lot of negative effects that can come because of guilt.
Yes.
Whether it's depression or low self-esteem or whatever other issues may arise in our life because of the guilt and not able to overcome them. So guilt can be a positive thing and it can help us.
Right.
But guilt can really wear us down if we don't deal with it properly.
I'll tell you something else in between the guilt and in between the guilt and the grounding, I would call it. You need to have that forgiveness. And that self-forgiveness in between there is really what is needed. If you can come to that point to where you can find that forgiveness of yourself in the midst of your guilt, acknowledging this, then you're not going to take that next step. And I believe that there are a lot of people today who have a sense of guilt and shame of things that they have done and realize perhaps at this moment, just like Paul on his way to Damascus, he found out some things were wrong. And then it comes up almost like an avalanche, and it's kind of blow you over, so to speak. But if we don't get that step between this guilt, forgiveness, and grounding, then we're going to have a difficult time really functioning well in every aspect of our lives.
So in order for guilt to be a positive thing for us, we must be people who are willing to forgive ourselves first.
In the middle, yes.
Yeah. So that's a hard thing to do sometimes. But guilt, if we're going to allow guilt to help move us forward and help us become stronger, then it begins with forgiving ourselves.
Yes.
It's a great point. You see, as we think about, as we build on that idea, there's something else we learn from the Apostle Paul that I think can help us as we're dealing with guilt and shame in our lives, and that's the fact that we must allow our guilt or use our guilt as motivation moving forward. It can be a positive thing for us, especially if we allow it to motivate us to move forward. Maybe you've heard of Ivan Pavlov. It's a man who's known for the development of this classical conditioning. And in his experiments developing this classical conditioning, what he did is he did some experiments using a bell and using dogs. And so what he did is he would ring a bell, and he would provide food for the dogs at that moment.
Okay.
And so what he began testing was, at the sound of the bell, could he condition the dogs to begin salivating because of the thought that food was coming?
Yes.
So he began conditioning them based on something that they had experienced.
Okay.
As we think about that from the perspective of guilt and shame, I think it's important that we understand that we can condition ourselves, that when we are experiencing or feeling guilt and shame in our lives, that we can find motivation to push ourselves forward when we think about those events that bring guilt to us. So the more we experience that pain, we want to avoid that pain. So when we begin going down that path where maybe that pain of guilt and shame is coming, we can motivate ourselves to take actions or to do things differently to avoid feeling those feelings of guilt and shame once again.
Yeah, you can make some adjustments, some coping skills as far as that is concerned. And when you start looking back at it, as you talk about the classical conditioning, the idea of it is that we have these things in the back of our mind. It's not as though we always forget them, but we kind of gently place them in the back of our mind. It's the only way we can function. But certain incidences, you make mention the bell. Well, there are certain things that cause us to behave and to think and to move forward on some things. Just hearing a sound, hearing a statement, seeing a picture, things like that, that would really get us back out down to the guilt part, because it happens about a reliving of it as though it happened that very day. So we come back at it again. So store it back, but some type of action, some type of event can trigger that, and then we're back where we are, where we had to deal with that, even if it's for the moment. We can work with that and then be able to move forward. We'll feel some sadness because we remember it, but it'll last for a moment, then we work through it. So there may be some periodic times when that happen occur, but we keep moving and think the good part about things and how you've overcome it. That's what you have to do.
Yeah. You know, the truth is, we can't undo our past,
No,
right?
cannot.
We can't go back and undo what's already been done, but we can control what we do moving forward. And so we can look at our past and realize this is a reality. This is the way things are. We can't undo what we've done. This has happened. And so we can either allow that to eat us up,
Yes.
or we can look at it and say, you know what, I made a mistake, but I'm not going to let that mistake define me or control me, but I'm going to use it as motivation to move forward.
Yes.
You know, the Apostle Paul, here's we think about this case study of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
He was a man that always remembered his past. He remembered the successes of his past,
Yes.
and he remembered the failures of his past. In
Right.
fact, as the Apostle Paul was reflecting on his past, he said in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15, that he was the chief of all sinners. Right? He never got over the guilt of what he had done.
No.
And he realized that if anyone was to be known as a sinner because of their past, it was him.
Right.
No one is a greater sinner than him.
Right.
But he also remembered the successes of his life too. He remembered the good things of his life. In Philippians chapter 3, verses 3 through 6, he talked about some of those successes.
Okay.
He talked about his successes in his Jewish life and his reputation as a Jew.
Okay.
You know, he was the Pharisees of Pharisees of the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the sixth day, and all of these things that set him apart as someone who was successful and someone that was great. But the thing was, he never forgot his past. He never forgot what he did, but he didn't let those things control him. In fact, as he moved forward in Philippians chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, this is what he said. He said, "Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." So he didn't forget his past, but he didn't let his past control him. Instead, he used his past as motivation to focus on the goals at his present time and the goals he has for his future. His goal now was to be faithful to God, to be obedient to God, and to strive to attain that calling that had been issued to him. So he could have let his past overwhelm him and overcome him, but instead he allowed his past to motivate him and help him focus on his present and future goals.
That's right. I mean, if you look back and he named off a list of things that will cause us to feel guilty and that would bring a public outcry and shame. He said, I before was a blasphemer. I was an injurious person. I did all of these things. He realized that he's really caused a lot of pain. He's really made havoc on the lives of many. And he felt guilty about that, but as you said, that guilt became a tool, a coping tool for him to move forward and to do some great things. So I do believe that when you look back and see where you were, and when you look at where you are now, that gives you that sense of saying, yes, I can't undo the past, but I can deal with the present, and I can change the future. That's about all we can do on that. If we don't make that type of mental adjustment, emotional adjustment, then we're going to have some issues coming on down, not just down the line, but even right now.
Yeah. You know, if we forget our past, then oftentimes we don't realize who we are in the present, because our past shapes us with the good things and the bad things. But we can't let our past control us. But instead, when we use our guilt and our shame, and we use our past to motivate us to be better, then it helps to change the way we perceive ourselves, but it also begins to change the way other people view us.
That's true.
That
is true.
So here's where I want us to shift gears just a little bit. You know, we've talked about in the life of the Apostle Paul some of the things he did to help him overcome the guilt and shame in his life.
Yes.
But here, what we also notice in this case study of the Apostle Paul is the impact that other people had on him overcoming his own guilt and shame.
Yes.
So let's think for a minute about our responsibility towards those who are facing guilt and shame in their own lives. Whether we realize it or not, we have the way we treat others who are experiencing guilt and shame goes a long way in affecting how they recover from their guilt and shame. We hold a lot of power over people who are experiencing guilt and shame. And the problem is oftentimes we have a tendency of seeing people for what they've done rather than seeing them for who they can become.
Good point.
Let's think about the Apostle Paul for a minute. Right? Here in Acts chapter 9, there are a number of different individuals who see the Apostle Paul after he's had this transformation. Right? He's had this pivotal moment on the road to Damascus where he's realized his past life wasn't right, and he's feeling guilt and shame for it. And now he has these interactions with a couple different people that really have a powerful influence on the way he overcame his guilt.
Gotcha.
So let's think first about a man by the name of Ananias. We talked about him a little bit ago, but it's really fascinating to see the impact that Ananias had on him.
Yes.
So after Paul had been blinded by Jesus on the road and sent on to Damascus to wait for Ananias, Jesus then appeared to Ananias in a vision. And we see this in Acts chapter 9, verses 10 through 12. And he calls on Ananias to go and preach to the Apostle Paul. Now, what I think is really interesting, and one thing I love about the Bible, is that we see that these are real people who experience the same emotions and same feelings that we do, because if I was in the shoes of Ananias, I would have said and thought the same thing Ananias did. Notice what he said in response to Jesus after Jesus told him to go and speak to the Apostle Paul. Look at starting in verse 13. It said, "Then Ananias answered, 'Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has the authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name.'"
Yes.
Here Ananias says, "Are you sure, Lord? Are you sure he's the one you want me to go to? You know, this man has done a lot of things to harm your church.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of things to other Christians. In fact, he has the authority that if I go and talk to him, he can take me bound to Jerusalem. Are you sure this is the one?" But Jesus continues and explains in verse 15 that Paul's a chosen vessel for him.
Yes.
And he needs Paul. So Ananias, even though he had reservations, he had concerns,
Yes.
he went and he met with the Apostle Paul. But notice how he addressed the Apostle Paul in verse 17. He walks in and he sees the Apostle Paul and he says, "Brother Saul."
Yes.
What do you think that kind of a response, or him addressing him in that way, how do you think that would have affected the mindset of Paul?
I think, just after you've done some things and you realize how destructive you've been and how you've caused a lot of hurt, and if someone comes to you and they accept you, not only just as you are at that moment, but accept you as the person that you could be, and they simply say, "You're my brother, I embrace you." So we have to always be ever mindful of the fact that we need to differentiate between accepting a person and accepting a problem. What's the old saying? We ought to, as God love the sinner and hate the sin. So we're at a point to where we need to learn how to let people know that God loves them. So do we. We understand where you've been, but we also know where you can go. We understand your hurt and pain, and we understand your reputation right now. But we're going to be reaching out, embracing you as somebody who's trying to make a change so that they can make a difference in life. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah. I think about the comfort and the confidence that maybe this would have instilled in the
Yes.
Apostle Paul.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't know what Ananias was going to think about him or how he was going to treat him.
Right.
But the first time that Ananias speaks to him, he refers to him as Brother Saul. Now, I can imagine that maybe there was a weight that was lifted off of him, where he realized, okay, maybe I can do this. I can overcome this guilt and shame in my life because this person is here to help me through it. So the response here from Ananias was huge when it comes to helping Paul overcome the guilt and shame in his life. But not everyone treated him the same way that Ananias did.
Oh, no.
As we move forward here in Acts chapter 9, we see where Paul, after he's been obedient to Jesus, he's been baptized in verse 18, and he begins preaching some in verse 20, and now he decides he wants to go and he wants to meet with the rest of the disciples in Jerusalem.
Yes.
So he makes the journey to Jerusalem, and what's really interesting is we see where the disciples there in Jerusalem,
Yes.
they didn't respond the same way Ananias did. In fact, in verse 26, we see where they were afraid of him, and they didn't believe that he was a disciple.
That's true.
As they saw the Apostle Paul, they saw him for what he had done. They saw him for his past. They saw him for him being a great persecutor of the church, and they failed to see him as a brother.
Yes.
And it wasn't until Barnabas showed up, verse 27, and stood beside Paul that the other disciples started to come around on the Apostle Paul.
Yes.
Now, let's think about this question for a minute. And I recognize it's a hypothetical question, but let's think about this for just a minute. How do you think the story of the Apostle Paul might have been different if it wasn't for Barnabas standing beside him? How would it may have been different if here the disciples continued to pile on to the guilt and shame of Paul instead of standing beside him?
Well, just looking at it from a human point of view, you would be thinking that that would have taken and had a tremendous negative impact on him. Could have caused him to withdraw. When you withdraw, you're lonely, and when you're lonely, you begin to have some other challenges as well. I tell you what, we can only imagine that, but many of us have been in that direction where if it had not been for this particular person to really stand by us, stand in our corner, we think that we perhaps would have given up and would have just left it all alone. That's a probability. But I'm looking to have that conversation. I'm looking to have that conversation with Paul when all is over and then we all done got our wings and went on to heaven. I like to have that conversation with him then.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about what his life may have looked like.
Yeah.
Maybe he would have thought, you know what, I realize that Jesus is Lord, so I'm gonna continue to be a faithful Christian. But these disciples, they don't want me. They don't respect me. They don't care what I have to say. And so maybe he would have continued to be a faithful Christian, but maybe he never would have become an apostle. Maybe he would have just been a tent maker, right? Maybe he would have had another career, but just been a faithful Christian and never became the Apostle Paul. But instead, we have this man who wrote more than half of the New Testament. We have this man who baptized and studied with and led so many souls to Jesus. And I wonder if it wasn't for Barnabas, would he have had that same impact? I'm not sure.
Well, that's right. We have to get Barnabas is the great encourager, and we need people like that in our corner, especially when the chips are down and people have a sense of fear of us. There's a lot of disbelief surrounding us. We need the people in our corners whom others admire, standing up, highlighting the good parts of our lives and our capabilities. We need people like Barnabas, those people who are encouragers And when they see that, who's highly respected, they kind of open up a little bit and start giving the people a little chance where perhaps they never would have.
Yeah. You know, it's not something that's necessarily wise for us to just forget the past of someone. Right? That's not what we're called to do.
Right.
You know, it wouldn't have been wise for those in the church in Jerusalem and those disciples in the first century to just say, you know what, we're going to forget that you ever persecuted the church, Paul. Because the reality is that did define part of who he was.
Yes.
So it's not wise for us necessarily to forget what someone's done in the past, but we must not hold their past against them to the point that they are no longer able to grow and develop and become who they can be in the future. You know, because of Ananias, because of Barnabas, the Apostle Paul was able to work through the guilt of his past and become someone who was crucial to the ministry of Jesus. And so when we think about those who maybe have hurt us or wronged us or done something that is deserving of guilt in their lives, we need to understand that we can't just hold that guilt over them to the point where they can no longer grow.
Gotcha.
Because there's no telling what they can become or who they can become when we choose to embrace them and walk hand in hand with them through their guilt and through their shame and help them grow from or as a result of that guilt.
That's true. I tell you what, sometimes, you know, that ought to really inspire us. Said, I know him. I know from whence he's come, and I know where he's been, and here he is now. That to me simply ought to spark a little of an air of amazement on our part at the individual, and to see how they have had such a big change, as you said, an epiphany in their lives, and that's just this great metamorphosis in the sense that they have become someone totally different than what we have known and experienced.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, all of this discussion through this study, this case study of the life of the Apostle Paul, there's a lot of valuable things I think we can pull from and learn from.
Oh, yes.
But let's think about it from a spiritual standpoint for just a moment. Here's the thing that we all as Christians need to keep in mind. Jesus doesn't hold our guilt over us, so we shouldn't hold guilt over others. You know, you think about our lives. We're told that all sin and all fall short of the glory of God.
Yes.
All of us have done things that we are guilty in the eyes of God.
Okay.
Right? But Jesus, through his grace, has chose not to hold us accountable for that guilt or hold that guilt over us, but instead offered us grace to provide hope for us moving forward. I think about what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, where he said, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into his grace, in which we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of God."
Yes.
So here the Apostle Paul, again, as he's reflecting on his life, he realizes the guilt that he experienced. Man, I spent so much time in my life persecuting the church and persecuting Christians and trying to tear down the name of Jesus.
Yes.
And even though I did all of those things, Jesus didn't hold that guilt over me, but instead offered me grace.
Amen.
Because he knew that I deserved it, and because of that grace, he was able to grow and develop into a man who did great things for God.
Right.
So if Jesus isn't going to hold our guilt over us, then we need to be people who aren't going to hold guilt over other people.
Yes, I think you're correct, and I think the only thing that's going to lead us to that type of approach is love. The Bible teaches us that love thinketh no evil. In other words, you know, the point of it is that we don't have a catalog of someone's misfortune, misdeeds, their sins, and we whip it out on them, bring it out anytime we feel like we need it to sometime win an argument or win a battle or to get our way. But love is at the very front of this. And if we love people, we understand their path. The point of it is that I don't bring it up in order to get an advantage over them, or to put them down, or to emotionally, physically, financially, or anything to destroy someone. If we have that kind of love the way we should have, we understand, we know what's been happening, we know what took place, but the point of it is that love thinketh no evil. It doesn't catalogs, it doesn't write down, doesn't keep a listing, a running list of someone's wrong.
Yeah. You know, guilt and shame is something that all of us have experienced in the past. And it's something that for as long as we have breath left in our lungs, that we're going to experience it moving forward. All of us make mistakes, and all of us do things we regret.
Yes.
But it's how we deal with that guilt and with that shame that's so important. We must learn to deal with it in a proper way.
Yes.
You see, as we've considered and looked at the life of the Apostle Paul, we've realized a few things. We've realized that guilt can be both a positive thing and a negative thing.
Yes.
Guilt can help us to become stronger and help us to become better moving forward. But if guilt goes unchecked, it can lead us down a dangerous path, like we saw in the life of Judas. But not only can guilt and shame be a positive or a negative thing, but we should be people who allow, who condition ourselves to find motivation in the midst of guilt and shame, so that we can try to be motivated not to face those things or feel those things anymore. And so when we can find that motivation to move forward, then we can become focused on our future and focused on our present time, and not so overwhelmed by our past.
I think you're right.
But the third thing here we learn from the Apostle Paul is the way that we treat and the way that we deal with those who are experiencing guilt can go a long way in the way they recover from their guilt. We have obligations when it comes to those who are guilty towards us.
Yes.
To be people who demonstrate love, to be people of forgiveness, and to do things and say things that can help people grow from their guilt rather than be consumed by their guilt. So,
good point.
We don't know what maybe you're struggling with or what you're dealing with in your life. Maybe you've become overcome and overwhelmed by guilt and shame, and you struggle knowing what to do or where to go. We'd encourage you, if you're in that situation, to seek after help, whether it's reaching out to us or reaching out to someone else that can help you. You don't have to be so consumed by your guilt, but instead, your guilt can actually help improve you to become someone better moving forward. Amen. So if you're struggling with guilt, find an opportunity to seek help, find help you need to overcome and to improve yourself through that guilt.
Yes.
We hope that this discussion has been a blessing to you. We hope that all of us can understand that guilt isn't something that has to consume us, but we can become better for it. We appreciate you joining us. We hope that you'll continue to join us every Thursday at noon on the Abundant Life Podcast.